So our next group of speakers is State of Arizona Research Library staff member, Asa Espanto, with her MLIS. She's our newspaper librarian, and University of Arizona News Research Librarian, Mary Feeney, also with her MLIS. And they are going to speak on finding your family in historical newspapers. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Great, thank you. And I think Asa is going to share the slides.
Yes. Share my
Hi, everybody.
Hello, welcome. Let me get this in presentation mode.
Awesome.
Where are you? Slides. There we go. Does that work? Everyone can see?
Yeah, looks
Perfect.
great. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Welcome, everyone.
Hey, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us for our presentation today, Finding Your Family in Historical Newspapers. And thank you for the introduction. I will just add, I'm also a personal genealogist. I love doing family research. So I'm excited to hear what everybody else is going to talk about today. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear me say that a lot. This was mentioned in Secretary Fontes's message, but the State of Arizona Research Library and the University of Arizona Libraries are partners on a National Digital Newspaper Program grant, which we'll call NDNP. And this is granted by the National Endowment for the Humanities in partnership with the Library of Congress. The newspapers that we digitize are made available to the public completely for free and open through Chronicling America, which is the national platform from the Library of Congress. And together, Asa and I are the co-principal investigators and co-project directors for that grant. So we are going to talk about newspapers and genealogy, but we're going to give you a little bit of background on the program first. So next slide, please. Okay, so in our presentation today, you will hear about this national program and also Arizona's place in that, and then learn how to access digitized historical newspapers from Arizona and around the country through Chronicling America. And then also learn about what kinds of information you can find in newspapers about your own families and the communities in which they lived. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start, as I said, with a little background on this newspaper project, and that's to give you some context about what is available for your family history research. Next slide. So the NDNP is a partnership, as I've said. It's a competitive grant program for states to digitize 100,000 pages of historical newspapers that are in the public domain through 1963 from their state. And that's 100,000 pages per grant cycle. These digitized newspapers are totally freely available. Some of you may be already familiar with Chronicling America, and we'll be sure to put a link in the chat for you to how to access that. So as of this week, there are over 21 million pages available on Chronicling America, covering back to 1759 up through 1963. And of this latest round of grants that were awarded, Chronicling America is now going to have newspapers from all 50 states. All partners have joined, as well as Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. It covers more than 4,000 newspaper titles in 22 languages, including from Arizona's last grant that we did. We digitized a newspaper in the Navajo language. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. So the current award, this is the 5th NDNP grant for Arizona. This partnership that we really are happy about working together on this. And as of a few weeks ago, when we completed these slides, there were 110 titles from Arizona available in Chronicling America. But we're really excited to share that just within those last couple of weeks, there are now 125 titles from Arizona, and more are going to be coming soon, which we will share that information as they become available. The time period covered by Arizona titles that we've already digitized goes back to 1859 during territorial Arizona and up through 1963. In our last grant in 2017-2019, we really prioritized including newspapers from diverse communities in Arizona. So we digitized several Spanish language newspapers, newspapers of Black communities in Arizona, tribal newspapers, and then several newspapers published in our border communities. And now our current grant, which we're in the middle of right now, it runs from 2022 through August of this year. We are again focusing on additional Spanish language newspapers published in Phoenix, Black community newspapers, including a couple of that were published in Tucson, where I am, more border news, and newspapers published in mining and agricultural communities. Those are some of our new content that we're going to be adding. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And just briefly here, you can see a few of the newspaper titles that we digitized from last time. There were many, many more, but just a sampling. For example, El Sol, which is a Spanish language newspaper published for many, many years in Phoenix. The Arizona Post, which was a Jewish American community newspaper published in Tucson. The Navajo Times, which I mentioned earlier, I believe, and the Arizona Sun, which was an African American owned newspaper published in Phoenix during the 20th century. So those are just a sample of the many, many papers that you can find. Okay, and then next slide. And then here you get a sneak peek at some of our newly digitized newspapers, or ones that we are currently digitizing that are going to be added to Chronicling America. So one is the Buckeye Valley News, which obviously was published in Buckeye. Really fascinating title, the Brewery Gulch Gazette, which was published in Bisbee. The Buffalo, that was published in the 1940s at Fort Huachuca, which was home to the 92nd Infantry of Black soldiers. And El Machete, a Spanish language newspaper published here in Phoenix in the 1940s. So again, just a little bit of a preview of some of the new content that you'll be able to access. Okay, now I'm gonna turn it over to Asa.
Oh, all right. So here's a screenshot of what the up to now website for Chronicling America has been. I saw a couple of folks in the chat from the last presentation had mentioned they'd used Chronicling America a few times. So this has been the website up to now, but it is actually being transitioned to a new website. So we just wanted to give you guys a little sneak peek. This is still in beta, so it's not fully fleshed out yet. Still got some quirks to figure out, but it's going to be Chronicling America's new platform. So this is kind of what it looks like. We've got this next page where you'll be able to search all digitized titles. There's several filters here, so you can search by state and then ethnicity, language, etc. I will just include a little note that we found out through searching through this new version that you have to apply the state filter first, and then the ethnicity and language will populate that's relevant to that state. So for example, there's here for states, and then when you go to the next, filter search for ethnicities, we don't have any Czech or Danish or Filipino papers in Arizona. So if you were to, put them all in at the same time, you wouldn't really get much. So set your filter for your state first, and then the ethnicity and language options will populate accordingly. So yeah, but you get a very nice long list. There's currently 4,054 and counting. So that's exciting. You're going to find new things all the time. And yeah, a lot of language variety. Here's for Arizona specifically. So this was as of a couple of weeks ago. It is now a higher number, but it's 119 titles. And yeah, they should be listed alphabetically. You can, again, search, apply more filters as needed. But from here, you should be able to browse digitized issues, look at individual pages. The pages are available for download and high resolution images. You can get PDFs, JPEGs, etc., TIFF images. So yeah, you've got a lot of variety. This should be text searchable as well. And each title that's been included should include a, what is it? It's like a title essay. So it gives a lot of context about the history of the paper and, how it came about. And that's a lot more historical context for researchers to kind of, get a bird's eye view of how things came to be and why the paper is significant. Oops, go back. There we go.
Oh, great. Over to me, I think. So with that, a brief background, and we can talk more in the question and answer period if people have more questions about Chronicling America. But with that background about our Arizona newspaper digitization program and Chronicling America, we want to now talk about what you're all here to hear about, which is using newspapers for genealogy research. So next slide, please. And we do want to provide a content warning. And this is just really historical content in newspapers, and really other primary sources, of course, are from time periods when they may contain offensive and hurtful terminology in reference to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, and class. And, that is sometimes the nature of some historical materials, but we don't censor or edit those materials. So you just, sort of let you know that you might encounter some of that offensive language when you're using historical newspapers. Okay, next slide, please. So what can you learn about your family in newspapers? You can see these young ladies are poring over these old newspapers, but you can do that online with the ones we've digitized. So you can find out all kinds of things. We've listed some here, and I will read through some of them. You might learn who their relatives were. You might learn where they lived. Some of the most common items that you probably have come across are birth, marriage, and death announcements. And from those, you can glean a lot of additional information. So for example, when and where a family member was born, their parents, siblings, if they had any children, what their names were, and possibly spouses and grandchildren and extended family. You might also learn about their community members, godparents, cousins, friends, and all of that are little pieces of information you can then use for more research. Newspapers also sometimes had listings of naturalizations, and new citizens might be listed. They often listed activities that were being held by clubs and churches, as well as listing the names of members. So if you know a club that someone was in, you can search that, or if you search their name, you might learn about their participation. I've actually seen also listings of jury service, so people that were called up for jury duty, as well as business ownership, details about military service, such as lists of people who were enlisted, where they served, etc. Also, you might, by searching on a family member's name or address, you might learn about real estate sales or land purchases and get additional information about that. You might even read about a family member receiving an award at a school. I've seen information about kids appearing in a school play or a concert, lists of graduates from high school or college. And I think that's what's really great about these smaller community papers is that they really did focus on community members. And so there's a lot more detailed information than you might find in like a larger newspaper. You might also learn about their participation in sports. And very often historical community newspapers mention people's just everyday comings and goings and visitors they received. And we're going to see some examples of that, but it's really kind of fascinating to see how often they talked about people coming and going and their visitors. And then I think importantly, beyond finding just information about your own family members, you can learn a lot more from newspapers about the community that they lived in. So that's going to provide you like this really rich context to fill in the story. And anyone who's interested in family history research knows that it's more than just the facts. It's that, you know, the really rich context of filling in the story of their lives based on what's happening around them. Okay, next slide, please. And so just some general tips for getting started. And I'm sure this is, you know, a lot of this is really familiar to people, but just to, you know, to share it again, is obviously start with whatever information you do know. You probably have some information about your family members, names, dates of when they lived, maybe a general idea of where they lived. And of course, you may want to expand around those dates and places in case it's not exact, but that's always a really good place to start. Another tip is that you'll want to pay attention to spelling variations of names, especially last names. And you may need to try multiple searches using all of these different variations of how names might have been spelled or misspelled, especially for immigrants where their names may have been changed. And then also for women in your family, you may need to actually search on a spouse's name if they were married. Often women were not referred to by their own name in the newspapers, but rather their spouse's name. So for example, Mrs. John Smith, instead of perhaps Anna Jones or Anna Smith. So just keep that in mind when you're searching as well. Newspapers very often carried these sort of personal columns, local columns, society columns. And you know, in addition to being able to search through those, you could also just browse through them once you know what community you want to look in and see what other kind of information you can find out about. And then finally, we do just another tip is that we want to point out that the digitized newspapers that we're going to talk about are really only a portion of the newspapers that once existed and were published. Some newspapers may have been lost to history. They weren't necessarily meant to be permanent records. And so they may have been lost to history already. But and of those that were saved in archives, there are many that have not been digitized. But despite that, these are still really great resources. we've made them easily searchable, and it may lead you to other genealogical resources. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Asa to start showing you some examples.
All right, so a couple of examples. These are from newspapers that we're currently digitizing. So a couple of examples of things you might find. So we've got social news and activities. We'd like to say that older newspapers are kind of like the Twitter of their time. So it's a lot of, so-and-so was visiting this school, so-and-so was visiting their relative, et cetera. It's just a lot of documenting people's comings and goings. People have always been interested in what other people are up to. And so the more local you go, the more likely you're going to find, documentation of specific people doing specific things. Sometimes probably things that maybe didn't want other people to know, but here we are. So this is from the Yahoo Copper News, 1935. You've got a variety of things, school related, school being out. There's other things about visitations or purchasing different things. So yeah, just a lot of daily activities and very highly focused on like social activities. This is from the Apache Drumbeat, which was published on the San Carlos Apache Reservation. So this is really interesting. It's about a talent show and just the winners of the talent show, who participated, where it took place. So you get a lot of, specific things like that, where it's, almost like a little article that was published within the newspaper to document the entire night, who won second place, who won third, what they did, how they helped, et cetera. So that could be really valuable information, especially for communities like tribal communities where, the documentation isn't always as dense as we would like. So yeah, things like the Apache Drumbeat are great. We've got a wide variety of papers like that. Births, of course, kind of the go-to for a lot of folks, but also we've got legal news. So on top of just below the birth announcements, we've got a couple of folks who were, sentenced to prison for 30 days for disturbing the peace, things like that, and definitely putting those people on blast. But it's interesting to see that people are, putting that out in a public newspaper, but here we are. And then we've got information unique to some Arizona newspapers. So as Leslie Carney mentioned in her presentation earlier about brands, so I believe it was Susie in the chat who mentioned the Sulphur Valley News that was on Chronicling America, and other papers like that. So we've got the Arizona Range News, which she mentioned that it wasn't on Chronicling America yet, but it is going to be. So this is from the Arizona Range News, and they published a wide variety of content like this for many years. We've also got Hoof and Horn, Southwestern Stockman, things like that. So if you're interested in brand records, this is also another resource for that. It's a really interesting, unique paper that served like a very specific community, but it's a really wonderful resource to have if that's something that you're interested in and you have a family legacy of ranchers, et cetera. No. Oh,
Okay,
and so I believe,
oh,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Take it away, Mary.
Is that for me?
Yes, yes.
I know, I was trying to remember which slide. Thank you, Asa. So I'm now going to show you, we're not going to do a live searching just because you know how technical things work, but I am going to show you some screenshots of how you would search for a specific person. So here again is that main page of the new Chronicling America site. And just I'll mention, you know, they're giving us time to, as they transfer over, but new content as of March 1st is only going to be available in the new site. So we want to get everyone used to the new site. And here on the front page, they show you front pages of newspapers from around the country from 100 years ago. And then there's a link there, again, not a live link, but collection items. So if we were to click on that, we could go to the next slide. You'll get this advanced search option where you can enter your search terms and then also set other search parameters. So my example that I have in here is I'm searching for Alberta Gibson, who was the editor of one of the newspapers we digitized before, the Phoenix Index. This was a Black community newspaper that was published in Phoenix in the mid 20th century. And so she was the woman who edited that newspaper, and she was the publisher as well. So here I've entered her name as a phrase, an exact phrase, but you can also, that drop-down menu, you can also look for all words, any words, and you can also do something called proximity searching, which is finding those words within 5 or 10 words of each other. And what's really nice about that, especially if you're looking for things like names, is that if you're not sure if a person's middle name was used or if a title was used, you're capturing that by doing a proximity search. Okay, so that would be a handy way to do that. And then because we're here in Arizona and she lived in Arizona, I've selected only Arizona newspapers. And I could also narrow even further by a specific county, a city, or even a specific newspaper title. And then of course, it's a little hidden by my drop-down menu there, but you can also put in date ranges. I didn't do that in this example, but that definitely will be handy, especially if your family member has a common name and you need to narrow it down some. Okay, so we could go to the next slide. And then here are at least the first few of my search results, which I can sort in different ways. You can see in that little select box over on the right that you can do some sorting. And what I also really like here is that you can see my search terms highlighted. So I can see in context where my search terms appeared. And then I also get to see an image of that newspaper page where the terms appeared. So it really makes it easy for you to find stuff. Okay, next slide, please. And then we're going to just look a little more closely at a few of the results to see what you can learn about a person. So in the highlighted part there, you can see that Alberta was mentioned in 1949. It says that she and Fred Johnson were secretly married, and it gives the date as well as her address where she lived. And you notice that this is an example of where it's under the Phoenix Social and Club News column. So there's some other marriages and club activities listed there. And then over on the other side of that screenshot there, unrelated to Alberta's genealogy, but wanted to include that here, is this hamlope with orange glaze recipe. I'm not sure if that sounds good to people or not, but and I point this out because this is what I was saying before about you might find some context about your family. Like, this is what they would have been reading in their hometown newspaper and viewing in their hometown newspaper. So it gives you an idea of like what was their daily life like. It gives you a sort of a flavor, I guess pun intended, of their daily life. Okay, next slide, please. And then here's another search result. You can see Alberta Gibson highlighted there. This is from the Phoenix Index, which was actually her newspaper. And this one, again, it mentions her address, but also gives me a little bit more information. It says that her father resides in Texarkana, Texas. So that's a little piece of information I got from just this little snippet that I can then use in another iteration of my search and piecing things together. Okay, next slide, please.
So just a quick
Oh,
note.
yes, please.
Add about the spelling that we had mentioned earlier. So you can see just below it says Dan L. Jackson, missing an O. Again,
yes.
We found that newspaper writers, editors were not particularly detail oriented when it came to spelling in the past, it looks like. So just something to be mindful of, it might be worth considering removing a couple letters or so, like in your searches, just to change it up and see what you might find.
Definitely. I mean, and just as a general search tip, which as a librarian, I would say this to any kind of research you're doing, is having a real strategy, even writing down, like, here's all the variations I'm going to try so you can keep track. Any of you who have done your own family history research, you can really go down rabbit holes and may forget that you've already tried that search before. So yeah, definitely different variations and then kind of keeping track of what you have already tried. Thank you for mentioning that. So I have mentioned Alberta's address a couple of times. It came up in her searching her name. So searching by address is actually another way that you can find information. And there's a few examples here. I know that it's probably kind of small on your screen, but a couple of these are examples that would not have come up in searching only her name, but they come up by searching her address. So this one under the personals column, and again, it's kind of small there, but it's this person, G.W. Barber from Tucson, was visiting his aunt, Mrs. A.J. LeMay, who was living at Alberta's address. Now, of course, it's possible that Alberta didn't even live there at the time, and this person might be unrelated, but we shall see in some later examples. The top example mentions the headquarters of a club that was meeting at her address. So that's another piece of information I can use to build out from. I might look into more about what that club was, right? And then the bottom example is actually the publisher box from the newspaper for which she was the editor. And what I think so interesting here is that we're learning that she actually published this newspaper out of her home, which is just, I think, really very interesting information. Okay, next slide, please. And just a few more examples on Alberta. Here we learned that in 1946, this says that she was the first Black woman called to serve on a jury in U.S. District Court. I would love to find out information like that about my family. I mean, that's so interesting that this little important piece of information about her, right? In the second example, in 1950, we get to see a photograph of her. So that's something else you might find in maybe more newer newspapers about your families, are actual photographs of them, right? And then the third one is about funeral services for Mrs. LeMay, whose name came up earlier under Alberta's address. And as you read through this small article here, this obituary, you learn that Mrs. LeMay was Alberta's mother, and it gives Mrs. LeMay's age, her church affiliation, when she came to Arizona and where. So she came from Texarkana, which again, we learned that Alberta's father was still living in Texarkana. It lists her children, her grandchildren, and her siblings. So lots of information that we can pull from that. And so I've already learned a number of things about Alberta Gibson. I definitely would want to keep doing some more searching, but hopefully you will have the same success with your families. And Asa is going to show you another example.
Yes, so we have Lee Park Lin, who is an interpreter for the Immigration and Naturalization Services in the early 1900s. He was based out of Tucson. So he was a Chinese interpreter, and he arrived in Tucson with his wife, Chan Phuc Thai, in, I believe, 1908 to Tucson. So it's really interesting to kind of glean little tidbits of information about him and his comings and goings, his career from our newspapers. So similar to what Mary did, I conducted a similar search, exact phrase, etc., and you get all these wonderful little flagged items. So just a couple examples. We've got this one on the left, which is this article. It's quite a bit longer than this, but I can't fit it all on the slide. So it's this article about a group of individuals who were captured by immigration services, and Lee Park Lin was summoned from Tucson to, I think it was in the Yuma area, but he was summoned from Tucson to provide interpretation services. So it's really interesting documentation that he was, mentioned and that his work was mentioned. And then to the right, there is a listing of individuals and professionals and their fees for their services. So Lee Park Lin is included here on the right, and his interpreter fee is $5. This was in 1912. So adjusted for inflation, that's about $150, $160 in today's money. So, not it was a pretty penny, so good on him for charging a reasonable amount. But yeah, so things like that, where you're learning about someone's professional career, especially in the Chinese community at the time, was relatively small. So it's great to have that.
Can I interrupt you really quick? Sorry. Oh. Folks are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Oh, no. Okay, sorry. I can speak up. My bad. Can you hear me now? Is it better?
I think so. Yeah. Just maybe speak a little louder.
Sure,
okay.
Sure. Sorry, I'm very soft-spoken. I'm sorry. So yeah, you can see here on the right that there's a listing. This is from a snippet in a newspaper about, it's like professionals and their fees that they charge for their services. So you can see Lee Park Lin, his interpreter fee was $5, which adjusted for today's money was about $150 to $160. So not an insignificant amount. So interesting to see, little tidbits like that about someone's professional life and what they could have been making, in their work, financially. And then we have this one. So this is from El Tucsonense, Spanish language newspaper based out of Tucson. And this is about a 4th of July event that was being put on. And it was basically, they were mentioning all these different countries around the world were all going to be celebrated. They each had a representative sort of a cultural celebration in Tucson. And so we have here for China, we have Don Chanwo, Lee Park Lin, and Lim Chung. So it looks like they were all three participants in the China portion of this celebration, which is really exciting, very cool. It's a cool community event. And then again, you get nods to other folks in the community, which you can, kind of weave the threads together. And then to the right, there's another article. We have No Chinese New Year in Arizona. And so just discussing how Lee Park Lin was a pretty prominent person in this community at the time in Tucson, because he's mentioned several times as kind of the go-to person when people were inquiring about what was going on and, within the community. So very interesting to see community involvement in like either a direct way or kind of a roundabout way. And then we've got here on the Arizona Republican. So there's a personal mention. Again, really interesting kind of information that people were documenting at the time. So all of these names are people that registered at the Ford Hotel the day before. So January 4th, 1911. Why you would want to know that is anyone's guess, but it's interesting to know Lee Park Lynn from Tucson was in Phoenix on January 4th, 1911. What he was doing there, we don't know, but that is for someone to research. And then on the right, we've got from 1920 in the Arizona Republican, we have his daughter, his eldest daughter. So we know we had multiple children. So Penny Lee Lynn was graduating high school. So it's exciting. And yeah, it's really interesting to find out that like family information you kind of glean from these little snippets. They're so small, but you know, you can really get a lot of information and kind of dive down the rabbit hole. And take it away, Mary.
Oh, okay, sorry, I wasn't sure.
Sorry.
This is just a few, I mean, there's so many newspaper resources out there, and we've included some of these links on the digital handout that you'll get. But of course, Chronicling America, which is, just to reiterate, it has newspapers from all around the country. And so, you know, we're focusing on Arizona, but a lot of you, I noticed in the chat, are not necessarily from Arizona. So you will be able to find, hopefully, your family members in Chronicling America from around different parts of the country. And then, of course, the Arizona the Memory Project, the Historical Digital Newspapers link is there. And that actually does include more than just what we have put into Chronicling America. There's some parameters around the grant and what we can digitize. And so the State Library and other partners have been able to digitize other materials to include an AMP. We've included a link there to the U of A libraries where I am. We have a historic Mexican and Mexican American press collection of newspapers. And those are from Tucson, Phoenix, but also we have some titles from California and El Paso in there that are all specifically published by Mexican Americans, and also some from northern Mexico. And then, of course, some of, you know, through libraries, you can access those news databases that require subscriptions. That's really going to vary depending on, you know, again, not all of you are here in Arizona. So check with your libraries. There's also, of course, personal paid subscriptions. I believe there's a question in the Q of A about newspapers.com. So lots and lots of resources available. I will say here at the U of A library, you can't access our databases remotely that we pay for, but if you're here in person, you can use those databases. And we have tons of stuff, as does your public libraries and the state library as well. Anything you wanted to add on the newspaper resources, Asa, or should I go to the next slide?
I can go to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, so next slide. And so we do want to include an acknowledgement here that this the Arizona Digital Newspaper Project that we've been talking about so much today was really made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that's a partnership again with the NEH and the Library of Congress and state partners from around the country. So we really couldn't have done a lot of this without their support. And the next slide, please. I think it's our last slide. Please do, Asa and I both love talking about newspapers, as you can tell. So if you have any questions about finding newspapers, newspaper research, tips, that kind of thing, please feel free to get in touch. We also did include our emails on that digital handout, so you'd be able to have that information to contact us later. And really looking forward to, I know there's already some questions that we will want to address. So I don't know if Diana, if we will back over to you. Thanks, everybody.
I promise I'm less soft-spoken on the phone. Sorry about that, folks.
All right, so we do have some really great questions. Thank you both so much for the presentation. So the first one that came through was, do we know when the Jerome papers will be available?
Ooh.
Within, I would say, we can't be sure because we submit batches to these digital batches to the Library of Congress. And a shout out to Amy Stave, who's our project coordinator. I mean, she's just managing all of that, and it's a tremendous amount of work. And their Library of Congress, of course, is accepting batches from all these states around the country. So it should be by, I would say, by the end of this calendar year. We already have seen some of our new batches loaded in the last couple weeks, as I mentioned. So we will definitely be putting out some press releases when some of these titles are being made available. So hopefully soon. It's going to be, I know Jerome Mining News, and then it changed title to Jerome News, but I don't have the exact dates in front of me right now.
Okay.
And sorry, one more thing can I say about that is that we are really interested in doing outreach to communities about their newspapers. So if the people from Jerome want to get in touch, we'd love to talk to you.
Do you still maintain physical copies of the newspapers after they are digitized?
Yes. So when available. So I suppose the answer to that is it depends. So typically a lot of the materials that we either have in print or we have on microfilm. Ideally, it's already on microfilm. Sometimes if we're lucky, we do have a print version as well, but we always want to keep and maintain as many copies and versions as possible. So in a perfect world, we've got a digital, a microfilm, and a print, and we like to keep them nice and safe. As you saw in Secretary Fontes's video, that's our stack. So a lot of print newspapers, trying to keep them nice and happy and alive as long as possible.
And I'll just say for University of Arizona, we have some physical copies, but most of what we have is either already at the state library on microfilm, or, for example, one of the titles that we are digitizing in this grant from hard copy, which is, I wish I had a picture to show you right now, is El Fronterizo, and that's a paper copy that's held in our special collections. Yeah.
Okay. Do either of you know if there were any German language newspapers published in Arizona?
I've actually gotten this question before, and if I remember correctly, there were not like German community papers, but I believe there were some German POW camp papers. One thing that you can do to find out, though, is through Chronicling America, there's something called the U.S. Newspaper Directory. And I'm going to see if I can drop the link for you real quick. I may not be able to do that real quickly, but you can search the U.S. Newspaper Directory by location and language, and it will tell you if any were published. That's a separate link than finding out whether they were digitized. And maybe while we're going on to the next question, I'll see if I can. Oh,
I just dropped it.
Awesome. Good, thank you.
Okay.
I could talk and get the link at the same time. Yeah,
well,
so
I was going to say it's a perfect segue into the next question, because it is: will the new Chronicling America website still have that U.S. newspaper directory?
Yes, and the link that Asa has there is the one on the current site. I'll try to dig up the one that's on the new site, but you can still, it's going to, all that information is going to transfer over. So yeah, okay. Thank you, Asa.
Can either one of you speak to the overlap that exists between Chronicling America and newspapers.com? Is one or the other more comprehensive? And then do some things exist on newspapers.com that are not on Chronicling America, and vice versa?
I can answer that if you want, Asa, because okay. I have a subscription to newspapers. It's so what's really interesting about newspapers.com is that because Chronicling America titles are openly accessible, and there's something called an API, which is a computer term where those can actually be pulled into different platforms. And so you might actually come across this sometimes where all of the newspapers that have been digitized in Chronicling America are being pulled into newspapers.com. So there's 100%, I shouldn't say 100%, nothing's 100%. There's a massive overlap of what's in Chronicling America and what's in newspapers.com. However, because the National Digital Newspaper Program we only digitize through 1963 because of copyright, which I could talk about more if you wanted to, but newspapers.com has made a lot of arrangements with publishers, and they put it behind a paywall, which enables them to digitize much more than we can. And they partnered with different publishers and libraries to do that. So for example, you can get some titles up through today, but we can't do that in Chronicling America. So there's definitely overlap, but I think they serve slightly different purposes. You don't have to pay for Chronicling America, for one.
And then can the resources that are on Chronicling America be accessed directly, or do you have to be either in like a library or an archives website or building?
From anywhere and everywhere. So no, you don't have to VPN or, have any kind of IP address approval or anything like that. You can jump online right now and look at everything.
Yep, okay. Totally free. Brought to you by your Library of Congress and the NEH.
Okay. Do either one of you know who would typically be the source for providing like the social news into newspapers?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I do think that it was, I think it was a lot more common in these historical, up to a certain time period where people wanted to share, little tidbits about what they were doing. But there were also reporters that would have gone out and gotten this information. So I think it was probably a combination of people letting the newspaper know, as well as going out and getting that news. But yeah, that's a really good question. I'm kind of curious to do some more research on that myself.
And it's hard to know for sure because bylines weren't commonly used or like industry wide until like the 1970s. So sometimes people do ask like, who wrote this? How do I know who wrote this? I'm like, that's a very good question. Sometimes I'm not sure there's an actual answer to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Will the new Chronicling America website allow for wildcard searching?
I believe it does. I think and I don't want to say anything 100%, but I think, I believe any features that you have in the current Chronicling America are also going to be possible in the new version, because part of it is that they're enhancing it and making it better. So again, I can't say 100%, but I'm pretty sure that that's transferring over.
Okay. And then can either of you speak to any newspapers from Glendale that have been digitized already?
Do you know, Asa? I know for Chronicling America, we haven't.
Yeah, nothing from Glendale specifically. We are focusing more on the West Valley during the current cycle. So not exactly Glendale, but in the general vicinity. So right now it's mostly like Buckeye, Tolleson, that kind of area. So yeah, but maybe in the future, I'd be interested to see if we have anything that fits the date parameters. I think like the Glendale Herald or Glendale News might. So could be a possibility.
And Diana, I see there's one in chat that could I address real quick. It says, you said Spanish language newspapers were only available at the U of A in person. Let me just correct that actually the newspaper I was talking about is from the U of A special collections, but we are actually digitizing it. So it will be available online. And the Mexican American Press digital collection that I talked about before, those are all available. So just to correct that all those Spanish language titles are available online, as well as the ones from Phoenix that we're digitizing.
Okay.
I hope that answers that question.
Are divorces commonly announced in newspapers?
I have seen that for sure in my own family research, because they would go through the courts and a lot of the stuff from the court was reported. And so they will sometimes, not everything necessarily will be in there, but I've definitely seen where it's like so-and-so has requested or filed for divorce from this person. And then they even say the reasons, like, cruelty or whatever.
Yeah, I think I've noticed that there's a sort of a correlation between how small the paper is, like how tight the community is and how detailed the information there is in it. You know what I mean? So if it's a really small local paper, you're probably going to find people's dirty laundry more on blast than if it's a larger circulating daily paper.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you know if there was a newspaper for Gila Bend in 1884?
I mean, we could look in that directory. I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. But we could, if we Are we saving the Q&A?
Mhm.
Because so we could maybe follow up with people
Yeah, I'm
on
curious.
things.
I'm like,
Yeah, I mean, we would have to just look it up because there's
mhm.
been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of titles published. So I'm sorry, I don't
Yeah.
know. But I'd be happy to follow up
Yeah.
if we are able to save the Q&As.
Yeah. Let's see here. Are there any papers published by the, and I'm so sorry if I butcher this, Partido Liberal Mexicano in Arizona, or in Spanish, by the Industrial Workers of the World in Arizona? I don't know if you've come across that title.
I don't believe so.
I have not come across that title.
I know
I
there
know
was.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I know there was some mention of this group in particular in relation to some of our West Valley papers, because there's a lot of agricultural community news. And I vaguely recall someone in our work on this project, someone mentioning like one of our papers might have had information about them, but nothing directly, like no specific publications by the group, sadly. But if we find some, I'd be interested. If you know of it, I'd be interested.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned kind of early on that unfortunately, I mean, even if something had been published, it's not everything was saved. I mean, that's a real shame about, like, archives can't save everything, and newspapers were sort of considered ephemeral for a while. So there are definitely things that have been lost to history. But yeah, definitely if people are aware of, I think the state library has pretty much anything that that did survive. But
we have a lot.
Yeah,
but if somebody has something, they found in an attic somewhere, like, please let us
yes.
know. I'd be happy and delighted to know about it.
Yes, and I will say that that actually has happened. So the
Mhm.
Arizona Gleam was a Black community newspaper that we digitized what the state library had in our previous grant. And when that was made publicly available, someone said they had more copies and they donated them to the library. And now we're able to digitize additional years. So it is possible that there's things out there that we don't have access to right now.
Yeah. Are there any fees associated with getting information from the newspapers?
Nope, not from Chronicling America. It's completely free. And one thing we didn't show you on our screenshots, but you can download the PDFs, page images. You can also take snips of and download those as well. So it's completely openly and freely available.
Okay. Can you, either one of you, speak to what are some of the best resources for historical and local newspapers? Is it just state libraries, local universities? What are some resources that they can use to access them?
Besides Arizona Memory Project and Chronicling America?
Yeah, I just, in general, it looks like.
Asa, were you going to say something? Sorry.
Oh yeah, I mean, Chronicling America is obviously a great resource. But if you're looking for something that has a different time frame, past 1963, then, I mean, even Chronicling America is a great resource to see what newspapers are available, because it has that, huge directory. It'll show you things all the way up to the present, in a variety of states and locations, things like that. So that'd be a good place to start to look for papers published in an area of interest. And then it will show you the holdings, so you can look and see what institutions might have a copy, whether that's, here in Arizona or elsewhere. It'll show you any library, whether it's a historical society, library, university, public library, et cetera. It will list all the places that it's available. So it's a really good starting off point, even if you can't find the newspaper there itself on Chronicling America.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, subscription databases of news resources that are available through public libraries, the state library, university libraries. We'll have things that go past 1963, and then also, there's also international resources. One of the links I was going to share, and I didn't put this on our handout just because it occurred to me later, but as one example. Sorry, this is the National Library Mexico, and they've digitized. Some of them are not openly available, but a lot of them are. So if you're looking at other countries as well, there are some free resources available out there.
How did railroads publish times and routes? Did they have their own papers, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I've seen, sorry, Asa, if you were going to say so. I've definitely seen railroad timetables. I've seen, and you could search for it, or as someone mentioned in the chat earlier, just browsing through the newspaper is a really good way to catch some of these things that might not pick up as easily in a search. But yeah, train routes and timetables. I'm trying to think of other transportation related things that people might find, but does that answer the question? I think they were definitely printed in the newspapers. It just depends on the newspaper.
Do either of you know if any of the railroads had their own papers?
I have not seen anything like that newspaper wise, but I mean, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but nothing that we've come across that we've digitized. And Asa, have you seen anything like that in your collections?
I agree. I haven't seen anything that's railroad specific as far as like a specific railroad publication of a newspaper, but like Mary said, it's not uncommon that specific organizations or companies or, sometimes unions would publish their own, publications, newspapers and whatnot, sometimes newsletters. So that one might be an interesting thing where it might fall into, if it does exist and it's not a newspaper, it could be a newsletter instead, in which case it might require a bit of a different type of search. A newsletter wouldn't really end up on Chronicling America. So it'd be a different type of dig.
Okay. I see in the, Corey sent me a message, and thank you, Corey, for reminding me. So one of the things we have to do for our this grant project, NDNP project, near the end is that we have to do a survey and prepare a report about where other Arizona newspapers digital holdings are that weren't part of our NDNP grant. And so that is something we're collecting that information, and I'm sure we could probably make it available somewhere.
Okay.
Thanks for all these great questions.
I know. Yay.
There's a lot of them. I'm trying to get
We
through
love
them.
newspapers.
I saw one about the South Mountain Star. Someone had asked if it had been digitized. To my knowledge, no. I think South Mountain Star was published in the 1970s and a little bit later. So yeah, it falls out of the scope of our dates as far as Chronicling America goes. We can't do past 1963 as much as we'd like to. But yeah, in the future, I mean, if South Mountain, if the goalpost of 1963 gets moved, then, happy to consider other titles. Yeah.
We've gotten a lot of questions too about, specific publications, like the, I'm blanking on the town name now, but anyways, there's another one about Tin Town, Arizona. And if we know that there's a newspaper from the 1920s, so I don't know if both of you want to speak about things that haven't been digitized yet and how they can find what your holdings and your records are for your individual institutions.
Well, I think probably the best place to look is that U.S. newspaper directory from Chronicling America, because it's probably the most comprehensive. Let me put that in the Asa already posted it, but let me put it in here again. That's probably the best place to start to see, because it is very comprehensive and it'll tell you who has the holdings. And then as far as the State Library, I believe you have a list or search. I mean, can't you find in the catalog?
Yeah, I mean, we have a catalog, of course. You can search through there. If it's not the specific publication you're looking for, then you might find some other relevant, adjacent information to help you in your search. And of course, you can always reach out to us, with questions, and we're happy to assist, see what we can dig up. Yeah, sadly, a lot of times it is the case where there's just nothing left. Like, maybe a publication did exist, but it wasn't saved, or, it was in poor condition, and, it's heartbreaking, but that's the reality sometimes.
Yeah. Do either one of you know anything about Genealogy Bank? No. Okay.
No, I saw someone put in the chat that it's a paid subscription, I think.
It sounds familiar. I haven't really utilized it.
So does the comprehensive list at LOC is it inclusive of all newspapers, even if it's not digitized?
Yes,
Yes.
that directory is, and it's as comprehensive as it could be based on states that did survey holdings many years ago and then update it. So there, of course, there could be things that are missing from the list, but it does include, and you'll be able to tell when you look at the lists, if you could click into them, you can see which ones have been digitized and which have not. So it does include other non-digitized titles. It's sort of an inventory, really, I think is maybe a way to think about it.
Right. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through really quickly and see if I've gotten to the majority of them. Okay, it looks like it. I don't know if there's anything else either one of you would like to share before we.
Oh, I will also say there are books published that are newspapers directories, so like physical print books. Typically they're older, but if you're, assuming you're looking deep into the past, we do have books that have, a bunch of titles listed, typically from like different regions around the state, different counties, et cetera. We may or may not have the actual newspaper, but if you're curious to know if a paper actually existed, then you might find it there.
Okay.
And there's also, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm going to put a link in here. There's also the AIR directory, and before that there was the RAL directory of publications, newspapers, and I think other periodicals. And some of those have been digitized the older years, so you can browse through, and it's like a directory of newspapers. However, I will say with the newspaper research that we've done, so Asa had mentioned those title essays earlier, and doing the research on those title essays, you find that sometimes, especially non-majority communities, their newspapers were not listed in some of those directories. So some Spanish language titles were not listed, some Black community newspapers were not listed. So even those directories are not 100% complete. But there are some also specialized newspaper directories. For example, there's one, I'm probably going to get the title wrong, but it's like American Indian and Alaska Native newspapers, and it's a like 2 or 3 volume book that lists tribal newspapers. So yeah, I mean, you could see we could probably do a whole day just about newspapers. We've scratched the surface, focusing mostly on chronicling America, but please, please reach out if you have questions.
We actually do have another question.
Okay, let me I'll just say, I don't think we're not really staffed to do genealogy research for people, but we can answer questions about what newspapers might be available.
Yeah. So if either one of you could share your background and how you became co-project directors and how others could potentially get into this field.
Oh, okay. Well, my background is, I'll make it short and sweet. So I have a background in French and art history. So I was more of a museum directed type of person initially. And then I started working in libraries and absolutely loved it, fell in love with the field. You love books, it just sort of, it's a good segue. And then, so I got my MLIS a few years ago and got a job here at the State Research Library. Absolutely love it. And now working with the newspapers. So it was luck, destiny, kismet, all of the above. And it's absolutely fantastic. And I've learned so much. Even so, I will say you don't necessarily have to be a deep, dark historian of newspapers to necessarily, be a special collections librarian.
Yeah, so my background, I also have my library science degree. I almost don't even want to say, I've been at the U of A libraries for 25 years. And I've been, besides being the news research specialist, I'm also a liaison librarian for history and journalism and gender and women's studies. And I've worked with journalism for those 25 years. Before that, actually during graduate school, I worked in the news library at National Public Radio in Washington, DC. So I have a long interest and passion for news research, and have been involved with these NDNP grants for probably 10 years, I think, because I've helped many people faculty and students mostly with their news research across disciplines. And so it just was a natural segue to then, make sure that we make these materials accessible, and had also been involved in the project where we digitized our Mexican American papers here at the U of A. So, it's like any career path, right? It just takes a direction and you just keep building on it. Keep building your expertise and learn from other people as well.
Okay. And then last question, somebody is looking for any type of farm news type of publications. Do you have any suggestions?
I mean, I would start with the geographic area you're interested in, because obviously, especially the further back you go, there were more rural areas that focus more on agriculture. So, I mean, if you're thinking about Phoenix, like the West Valley papers, focused a lot on agriculture. There was one, I think it was in the Tolleson Independent, where they mentioned the Agua Fria migrant community that focused a lot on farming and things like that. And there was a lot of information on their comings and goings, daily activities, and community news. So that might be a good place to start. But again, it would depend on the area that you're looking for, the area of interest, Yuma, or, middle of the state, north, east, south, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'll just add, that is one of the, agriculture broadly is one of the areas of focus for us for this current round of grant funding. We really wanted to start adding more newspapers from mining and agricultural communities. And so that includes ranching as well. And so Asa mentioned the Arizona Range News, also, again, those West Side papers in the cotton growing region. We are including some Ajo copper news, which had mostly been a mining paper, but because of the surrounding area, it's a lot of farm news. And actually was just preparing for a class I'm going to be teaching next week, and I came across, I think it might have been the Graham Guardian, where there was a lot of stuff about, because that was such an important part, and maybe still is, right, of their community. So lots of news focused on farming and agriculture in those areas.
Okay. And have you, sorry, they keep coming, guys. Has anybody run across adoption announcements in social columns or legal notices in newspapers?
I'm trying to think if I've come across them specifically. I know someone answered in the chat.
I mean, I've seen, as far as legal notices, things, the example earlier where it was just like, so-and-so was sentenced to this for, X amount of days for being a hooligan, whatever it was. So things like that. But I haven't encountered any sort of, major announcement. Yeah. Adoption, things like that personally, but that's not to say it's not out there.
Yeah. And I mean, you use that in your search, right? I mean, maybe even, just a last name and adoption, or if, searching to see if there were, special, columns that would have included that. I haven't really seen that, but that might just be because I just haven't come across it yet. Right.
I'd say you'd be most likely to find it in a very small local newspaper if it was going to be published.
Okay. And then if somebody finds a newspaper on Chronicling America, how do they search for a surname in that specific newspaper?
Good question. That's actually going to be made a lot easier with the new interface. You can, so let me make sure I understand the question. They want to search in a specific newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can, I don't know if I'd be able to share my screen quickly enough, but on the new site, you can put in your search terms and then select a specific title. Let me see if I can share real quick. I know we're running out of time here, but so this is the new Chronicling America. And so here where you put your search terms in, which you can use, there's that proximity search I was talking about earlier. And then as you select your place, then it populates these other sections here. And so you can choose county or city, but you can also, it might take a second to load here. And then you can also select a specific title. So if you know that you want to look in the Arizona Sun, for example, with your search terms, then you can do that there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both so much for such a great talk and all the answered questions.